two brothers, Romulus and Remus, gathered their men and founded a new city on the banks of the river Tiber, where they were nourished by a she-wolf all those years ago. While Romulus was hard at work, his brother Remus mocked him by leaping over his half-finished wall. Enraged, Romulus struck down his brother, proclaiming, "So perish whoever shall overleap my battlements." And thus, in 753, Romulus became the sole ruler of this new city that would bear his name in eternity. Having finished the outlines of Rome, Romulus set out to lay the foundations of his state. Believing his followers to be an unruly bunch, he assumed the outward symbols of power. He surrounded himself with 12 lictors, a custom borrowed from the nearby Etruscans. Lictors were a special bodyguard who carried fasces, a bundle of wooden rods bound with an axe. Lictors would accompany Roman magistrates who held imperium or the power to rule for the duration of the Roman state. Romulus then gave his people a set of laws. Transmitted orally, these laws would in time become a major source of internal conflict. He then opened the city to everyone, and large numbers of criminals, beggars, runaway slaves, and other men hoping to turn a new leaf in their lives flocked to his side. From these men, Romulus handpicked 100 of them to form the Senate. It is said that this number was chosen because it was deemed sufficient enough, or because there were only 100 respectable men in the city. These men were known as patres, and their descendants were the patricians. The rest of the free citizens in Rome were known as plebeians. Romulus organized the first Roman legion, numbering 3,000 foot soldiers and 300 horsemen. The army was formed from the citizen militia, and citizens were required to arm themselves. This meant that only well-off citizens could serve in the legion, while only the rich could finance a horse and serve in the cavalry. In this way, Rome became a formidable power, able to challenge every neighboring state. But for all their greatness, the Romans were doomed to die out in a single generation, for there were no women in the city. Romulus, heeding the advice of his senators, sent envoys to neighboring states to request intermarriage rights. Not appreciating this new power in their neighborhood, they all rejected his request. Angered, the Romans hatched a nefarious plot to get their way. Romulus ordered his men to organize the celebrations in honor of the god Neptune to the best of their abilities. No expenses were spared, and lavish games were held. Inhabitants of nearby communities were invited to participate, and many, eager to see the new city up close, answered their call. Among the guests were several Latin communities, and more importantly, the whole of the Sabine population. They marveled at the greatness of this new city, puzzled by the speed and quality with which the Romans had built their homes. The celebrations had begun, and while everyone was preoccupied with the magnificent display, the Romans gave a signal. In seconds, the heavily armed Roman troops appeared from nowhere, drove the men from their city, and captured the unsuspecting maidens. Romulus personally addressed the women, bidding them to lay aside their resentments and assuring them that they would find their husbands all the more agreeable as they would do their utmost to make up for the crimes committed. They were promised all the rights of free women in the ancient world, that is to say, very little. Their sons, however, would be free men and full citizens of Rome. The affected communities were not quick to forget their daughters, and they all sought help from the Sabine king Titus Tatius. He was too slow to act, and the citizens of Canina attacked Rome out of their own accord. They, however, lacked the strength to challenge the newly created legion and were easily defeated. Romulus personally killed their king and despoiled his body. Canina was easily captured, and returning to the city, Romulus dedicated a new temple to Jupiter Feretrius. He brought the spoils from the fallen king and presented them to the temple. In this way, he established the most illustrious military honor in ancient Rome, the Spolia Opima, or the rich spoils. Spolia Opima was awarded to a Roman general who killed an enemy leader in single combat. In Rome's long history and countless wars, the Spolia Opima was awarded only twice. First to Aulus Cornelius Cossus, who killed Lars Toluminus, the king of Veii, around 437 BC, and second to Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who killed Viridomarus, the king of the Insubres, in 225 BC. Following the fall of Canina, the other Latin communities acted alone and were all easily defeated. Titus Tatius, on the other hand, was a wise man who waited for an opportune moment to strike. Having made all the preparations, Tatius sent his armies to Rome. At night, the Sabines bribed a young girl to admit them to the citadel, promising her rich gifts. These gifts she never received, as she was instead killed for her role in the affair. With the first light, the Romans realized they were under siege from within, and they drew their armies up to the citadel. The Sabines suddenly advanced, pushing back the defenders, who fled towards the Forum. Romulus, still keeping his wits about him, invoked the name of Jupiter Optimus Maximus and encouraged his men to rally around him. A desperate fight was about to ensue on the streets of Rome, and the captured maidens looked on in horror. On one side were their fathers, and on the other their husbands and the fathers of their children whom they had grown to love. Desperate, the Sabine women jumped between the two forces, begging them to stop and reconcile. The armies and their leaders were moved by their appeals, and the two kings advanced to arrange a treaty. They agreed to join into a single state, with many Sabines moving to Rome and doubling its population. Leading Sabines were added to the Roman Senate, and the two kings, Romulus and Titus Statius, shared the kingship. Romulus divided the population of Rome into 30 curiae. Hoping to preserve the memory of the brave Sabine women, each curia was named after one of them. He then created the first citizen assembly, the Comitia Curiata, with each curia having one collective vote. This series of events, known as the rape of the Sabine women, became one of the foundational legends of Roman folklore. Throughout history, it was often depicted by many talented artists, symbolizing the conquest of territory through the appropriation of native women. The two kings ruled together in perfect harmony for 5 years. However, some relatives of King Tatius mistreated the Laurentine ambassadors. The Laurentines asked for reprisal, but Tatius rejected their claims. That year, when he traveled to Lavinium for an annual festival, he was killed by an angry mob. Romulus, happy to be the sole ruler once more, did nothing to avenge his colleague and renewed the old treaty between Rome and Lavinium. While Romulus was busy with these arrangements in the south, a sudden war broke out on their northern border. The small town of Fidenae, on the banks of the Tiber, anxious about the rapid rise of Rome, launched a quick raid into their territory. Romulus quickly gathered his armies and marched on Fidenae, which stood no chance against the full might of the First Legion. When the Romans were upon their gates, the Etruscans from the nearby Veii sent their armies to aid Fidenae. Romulus abandoned the siege of the city and turned his forces on the Etruscan army. They too were easily defeated, and the Romans marched to Veii. Seeing the strong fortifications, they abandoned the assault and turned back. A Roman colony was established in Fidenae, and a 100-year peace treaty was signed with Veii. One day in 716, while Romulus was inspecting his armies, a great storm arose, and he was enveloped in a dark cloud. The storm disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, and Romulus was gone. Thus ended the founder and the first king of Rome. In his 37 years on the throne, Romulus guided the city from a fledgling settlement to the chief power in Latium. After his death, Romulus was deified, and his cult was later assimilated with the cult of Quirinus, the indigenous god of the Sabines. In the wake of his death, the senators could not agree on whom to elect as king. The Sabines did not forget the injustice committed against Titus and wanted to elect a king amongst themselves. The Romans, on the other hand, would not suffer a foreigner ruling over them, and the Senate was in a deadlock. To perform the day-to-day duties of a king, the senators shared power between themselves in a period known as an interregnum. This lasted for a year and left the populace very anxious. They assured the Senate that if they did not agree on a king, they would choose one themselves. The Romans finally relented and agreed to elect one of the Sabines, but on the condition that they could pick the candidate. The Romans unanimously chose a man named Numa Pompilius. Numa was a pious man, living at Cures in Sabine territory, far from the bustle of Rome. He devoted his life to the service of the gods and had no interest in bearing the crown of Rome. On the insistence of the senators, he agreed to seek divine guidance, and only after the gods showed him favorable omens did he accept the crown. With Rome in a perpetual state of war, the men of Rome were more akin to unruly bandits than to proper citizens. Seeing this, Numa chose to found the city anew by reforming a wide range of laws and customs. He built the temple of Janus at the Forum. While Rome was at war, the gates of the temple would stay open and they would be closed only in peacetime. During Numa's reign, the gates stayed closed, but following his death, they were shut only twice, once after the end of the First Punic War and once after the Battle of Actium in the reign of Emperor Augustus. Numa feared that his people, so accustomed to the constant beat of war, would grow bored and unruly. To prevent this, he instilled the fear of the gods in the Romans and occupied their days with numerous rituals and religious festivals. Rituals that had previously been performed by the king were assigned to the high priests, who would remain in Rome even in times of war. The most important of these priests were known as the Flamines Maiores. They were the Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter, the Flamen Martialis, the high priest of Mars, and the Flamen Quirinalis, the high priest of Quirinus. Alongside these, he established 12 Flamines Minores, lesser priests responsible for minor deities. He also established the priesthood of Vesta and charged the Vestal virgins with guarding the sacred flames, a tradition imported from Alba. He next created the Pontifex Maximus, the chief of the Collegium Pontificum, or the College of Priests. The Pontifex acted as the chief religious authority in the city. All religious functions were placed under the supervision of the Pontifex, and all regulations on religion were in his charge. The title of Pontifex Maximus, or the High Priest of Rome, is still in use today. From the 15th century, at the height of the Renaissance, the title was adopted by the Catholic popes. Numa Pompilius reigned for 43 long years. Throughout his reign, he maintained peace and security in his realm and transformed Rome from a cultural backwater into a place of supreme worship. The nearby communities, which had previously seen Rome as a troublesome military encampment, now came to respect its devotion to the divine. Following the death of Numa in 672, the Romans elected Tullus Hostilius as their king. They could not have chosen a man more different from his predecessor. Where Numa devoted his life to the gods, Tullus had a mind only for war. He believed the Romans had grown enfeebled through inaction, and the king did not have to wait long for an opportunity to exercise his armies. On the border with Alba Longa, some peasants from both sides carried out unauthorized raids. Tullus used this as a pretext and declared war on Alba. The Albans moved first and marched close to Rome, where they were met by the full might of the Roman army. The commander of the Albans, Metius Fufetius, was unwilling to risk his men in open battle, and he invited Tullus to a parley. He warned the young king of the Etruscan threat on his borders and advised him to be mindful of his soldiers. Heeding his words, Tullus agreed to settle the matter in an unusual way. Both armies had a set of 3 brothers in their midst, the Horati among the Romans and the Curiati among the Albans. These brothers were equally matched in age and skill, and it was agreed that they alone would determine the fate of their states. The 2 sets of brothers clashed in full view of the 2 armies. After a prolonged struggle, 2 of the Horati were killed, but all the Curiati were injured. The remaining Roman brother, Publius Horatius, managed to separate the Albans and kill each of them in turn. Rome had thus prevailed, and the Albans honored the treaty and agreed to submit to Rome. The Roman army returned to the city in a victorious procession. At the gates of the city, they were met by the sister of the Horati. She was betrothed to one of the Curiati, and she burst into tears upon learning the fate of her beloved. Enraged, Publius killed his sister, sending her to join her lover in the afterlife. A murder in broad daylight could not be ignored, even for Rome's greatest heroes, and Horatius was put on trial. However, after his father condemned the actions of his daughter, Horatius was acquitted by the people. The tale of the conflict between the Horati and the Curiati became one of the most celebrated events in early Roman history. The proud Albans, however, were not pleased with this outcome. Metius encouraged other states to attack Rome while feigning an alliance. The people of Fidenae and Veii, assured that the Albans would revolt and aid them, declared war on Rome. Tullus Hostilius gathered his forces and summoned the Albans to his side. The armies drew up against each other, but when the battle started, the Albans retreated to a nearby hill, afraid of actually attacking the Roman line. Tullus acted quickly, encouraged his men, and led them to a swift victory. His wrath was now turned to the treacherous Albans. However, Tullus would not seek his reprisal from the men, but from their general. Metius was executed on the spot, and the Albans were informed of their fate. Their city was forfeit. It would be destroyed and never again rebuilt. All people of Alba Longa were moved to Rome and became full Roman citizens. The legions were sent to Alba, and a city founded by Trojan refugees that had stood proud for 400 years was destroyed within an hour. Rome grew considerably with the addition of the Albans, doubling its population and expanding beyond its original walls. Tullus nominated noblemen among Alba's most prominent families for the Senate, and the army was bolstered by strong contingents of the Alban troops. With this new force, he led a successful expedition against the Sabines, who were, according to Livy, second only to the Etruscans at the time. With this victory, Tullus won great renown for himself and his state as a whole. The days of peaceful Numa were forgotten, and Rome was once more vying for the control of central Italy. Tullus Hostilius reigned for 32 years. He was succeeded by Ancus Marcius in 640. Ancus was the grandson of Numa Pompilius and shared his grandfather's peaceful nature. However, circumstances would not allow him to devote his life to divine worship. The religious institutions, neglected by the warrior king, were promptly revived, and all the necessary rites were performed. While the new king busied himself with these religious matters, an enemy appeared on his border. The Latins, who had made several concessions to Tullus, believed the grandson of Numa would not dare to meet them in battle. They used this opportunity to renege on their promises and made incursions into Roman territory. But although Ancus was a pious man, he could rival Tullus in military brilliance. He would indeed go to war, but before mustering his armies, he formalized the method of declaring war that was followed long into the times of the Roman Empire. First, the Romans would send a herald bearing a message. The herald would recite an ancient prayer, calling on Jupiter, and lay out the terms 4 separate times. First when crossing the border, then to the first person he met, then upon crossing the gates of the city, and one final time at the forum. Having presented their terms, the Romans would wait for 33 days. If no satisfactory answer came in that time, the herald would again recite an ancient prayer calling upon Jupiter and Janus Quirinus, and the war would be declared by hurling a blood-smeared spear into the ground. This ensured that the Romans were never the aggressors, but always the side waging a just war. In this way, they secured the support of the gods and ensured favorable omens in the long centuries of war. The war against the Latins was thus declared in this way, and Ancus advanced against Politorium with his legions. The city was easily taken, and following the example set by Tullus, he transferred the whole population to Rome and destroyed the deserted city. Rome was now growing at an extraordinary pace. The earliest Romans inhabited the Palatine Hill, the Sabines settled on the Capitoline, and the Albans relocated to the Celian Hill. The Latin newcomers were settled on the Aventine. Having faced Politorium, Ancus advanced against Telenae and Ficana, and both were easily taken. The Latin defense was now centered around the strongly fortified Medulla. The Roman armies besieged the city, and fighting went on for some time. With great effort, Ancus defeated the Latin forces and returned victorious to Rome. With the city growing at a rapid pace, new defenses were needed to protect the inhabitants. Ancus constructed a ditch fortification known as the Fossa Quiritium. He also incorporated the Janiculum on the far side of the Tiber into the city. A first bridge over the river, known as the Pons Sublicius, was constructed. It was heavily fortified on the western end to protect from possible Etruscan incursions. The conquests of Ancus Marcius were not confined to a few Latin settlements. He expanded the Roman frontier to the sea, founding the port city of Ostia. At the mouth of the Tiber, he constructed salt pits, providing the state with a steady source of revenue. Ancus also expanded north, pushing back the Veientines and securing Fidenae and the northern frontiers. Ancus Marcius, reigning for 24 years, had thus surpassed his predecessors both at home and in the field. Under his leadership, Rome grew to new heights, and the borders of the state expanded significantly. During his reign, Lucumo, a wealthy man from Tarquini, moved to Rome. His father was a Corinthian, exiled from Greece. He settled in Tarquini and took an Etruscan wife. Lucumo was therefore seen as a foreigner in his hometown, and he decided to move to Rome, a young community where outsiders were not only accepted, but could rise to hold the highest offices. Lucumo took a new name, Lucius Tarquinius, and he was later named Priscus, meaning the elder. Lucius was generous with his wealth, winning over many friends and supporters. His deeds even reached the king, and soon Tarquin was made one of the chief advisors to the aging Ancus. Excelling in this position, Lucius was even named the guardian of the king's sons by his will. When the king had finally died, Tarquinius used his position to manipulate the elections. He first sent away the sons of Ancus Marcius on a hunting trip, and then quickly organized the elections, presenting himself as the only viable candidate. His generosity and his skill as an advisor made him popular with the people, and he was unanimously elected the 5th king of Rome in 616. His first order of business was securing support from the Senate. He enrolled 100 new senators, increasing the size of the Senate. These were known as the lesser houses and were supremely loyal to the new king. Having secured his position at home, Lucius marched against the Latin town of Appioli. The city was easily taken, and great plunder was brought back to Rome. To celebrate his victory, Tarquinius organized great games. For this occasion, he marked out a spot for the large oval stadium used for chariot racing. This later became the site of the Circus Maximus, the largest stadium in the Roman Empire. Amidst these celebrations, a sudden attack came from the north. The Sabines gathered a large force and marched against the city. So swift was their advance that they crossed the Anio and came close to Rome before the legions could be mustered. A bloody battle was fought near the city, but neither side could gain an advantage. Following the battle, Tarquin doubled the number of equites in the army. Using this new supremacy of the Roman cavalry, he crushed the Sabines and drove them into the river. Tarquinius led his forces into the Sabine territory, and the city of Colatia, along with all the surrounding territory, was taken by the Romans. Having concluded the war with the Sabines, Tarquin once more marched against the Latins. Numerous towns were captured, greatly increasing Roman territory. During the reign of Tarquinius Priscus, a marvelous thing happened in Rome. While a slave baby, Servius Tullius, was fast asleep, he was enveloped in flames. However, the flames did not hurt the baby, and he slept on. The people looked in awe, not daring to disturb him. Once he had woken up, the flames disappeared, and the boy was completely healthy. It was prophesied that this slave would have a marvelous future, and the king took him and raised him among his own children. In time, Servius Tullius grew into a youth capable in both body and mind, and the king betrothed him to one of his daughters. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus ruled Rome for 38 long years. In that time, he expanded the frontiers of the state and brought great prosperity to the city. Not everyone, however, was content with his rule. The two sons of Ancus Marcius, sidelined all those years ago, were still bitter about this foreigner taking their throne. They feared that Servius Tullius was gaining too much support from the people, and that soon a slave would sit on the throne of Romulus. Adamant on changing this, they hatched a nefarious plot. Two of their supporters, disguised as shepherds, entered the palace and pretended to have a heated quarrel. They attracted the attention of the king, and he agreed to hear them out. While one was explaining the situation, the other swung his axe, striking down the king. The queen acted quickly, closing down the palace, not allowing anyone to enter or leave. Healers were summoned, but it was clear the wound was fatal. She spoke to Servius, bidding him to take the reins of the city and avenge his father-in-law. Once he accepted, the queen addressed the people of Rome. She assured them that the king would recover in no time at all. For the present, while he was incapacitated, Servius Tullius would perform all the necessary functions in the king's name. Owing to the popular support of the youth, none objected. Servius used his time to strengthen his position on the throne, and once he was sure no opposition would arise, he announced that the king had succumbed to his wound. And thus, in 578, Servius Tullius became the first Roman king to inherit the throne. Having failed their plot, the sons of Ancus Marcius went into exile, never to be seen in Rome again. Servius was anxious not to share the fate of his father-in-law, so he married his daughters to the sons of the late king in hopes of gaining their support. Having thus secured his position at home, Servius looked for an opportunity to prove his worth in battle. The truce with Veii had recently expired, and he led an expedition against the Etruscans. A large coalition gathered to meet him, but that day the gods were on his side and the Etruscans were crushed. Servius returned to Rome in triumph. Having thus proved himself a formidable leader, Servius took on his greatest project. He conducted the first census in Rome and devised social classes based on personal wealth. The population was divided into 7 classes in total. The richest men in the city formed the equestrian rank. The men who formed the core of the infantry in the legion were divided into 5 classes. The rest of the population, who did not meet the minimum property requirements, were considered non-combatants and were placed into one final class. Each class was then subdivided into centuries, with equestrians forming 18 centuries. The first class was divided into 80, the second, third, and fourth classes each had 20, and the fifth class had 30. The non-combatants, although forming the largest block, were all placed into one century. Each century had one collective vote in the new assembly, the Comitia Centuriata. This gave the equestrians and the first class a clear majority. Voting was done publicly, from the richest to the poorest centuries. When a majority was reached, the voting stopped. Therefore, the lower classes would seldom have the opportunity to cast their votes. The second, equally important role of the centuries was fielding the Roman army. The equestrians were provided with horses by the state and formed the cavalry. The first 3 classes formed the core of the Greek-style phalanx, while the fourth and fifth classes served as lightly armed auxiliaries. As already stated, the poorest were exempt from military service. The men were required to arm themselves with prescribed equipment for each class. The first class had to provide a helmet, a round shield, a coat of mail, and greaves, all made of brass. They were armed with a thrusting spear and a short sword. The second class didn't have to provide a coat of mail and used wooden oblong shields. The third didn't wear greaves. The fourth class was armed only with a spear and javelins, while the fifth had only slings and stones. According to modern estimates, at the end of the 6th century BC, Rome had a population of around 35,000 men. From this, it is estimated that they could field an army of 9,000 men, 6,000 hoplites forming the legion, 2,400 auxiliaries, and 600 cavalry. This made Rome a formidable force at the time. Having thus reformed the state, Servius set about fortifying the city of Rome. He added the Quirinal, the Viminal, and the Esquiline hills to the core of the city, thus finally uniting the 7 hills of Rome. He surrounded all these hills with mighty fortifications, known as the Servian Wall. Sections of this wall survive to this day. This wall marked the boundary of the city known as the Pomerium. The Romans were forbidden to carry arms within the Pomerium, and magistrates with imperium had to lay down their power before entering the city. Just like the sons of Ancus Marcius proved to be the undoing of Tarquinius Priscus, so were the sons of Tarquinius the undoing of Servius Tullius. As we have already mentioned, Servius married them off to his daughters in order to prevent them from doing anything suspicious. Arnus Tarquinius cared little for the throne, for which his ambitious wife Tullia resented him. On the other hand, Lucius Tarquinius despised Servius and wanted the throne for himself. The two of them, hoping to finally take the throne, started plotting together. First, they killed their spouses and then moved against the king. They were constantly reminding people that Servius was never elected and that the census was just a way for him to steal their property. When Lucius thought he had acquired the support of the people, he walked into the Senate house with his bodyguards and called a session into meeting. While he was giving a lengthy speech to the senators, Servius marched in and asked for an explanation. Lucius, being a much younger and stronger man, physically threw Servius out of the Senate, where he was killed. Servius Tullius died in 534, having reigned for 44 years. Under his leadership, the city of Rome grew to new heights, able to challenge the powerful Etruscan states. Servius was succeeded by Lucius Tarquinius, later known as Superbus, meaning the proud. As soon as he took the throne, he instituted a reign of terror. He had no legitimate claim to the throne and had to maintain his position by violence and fear. He alone presided over criminal cases, condemning numerous powerful people to death or exile. His goal was to reduce the number of senators so the Senate itself would lose importance, and to amass large amounts of wealth from those he condemned. To further secure his position at home, Tarquin worked hard to secure the loyalty of the Latin people. At that time, Octavius Mamillus of Tusculum was considered the foremost man among the Latins. Tarquin gave him his daughter in marriage, thus securing the support of Octavius and his numerous followers. With his allegiance secured, Tarquinius moved to bind other Latin chieftains to himself. He summoned them to a meeting in the grove of Ferentina. When the agreed-upon hour had come, the Latin chiefs assembled, but the king was nowhere to be seen. Turnus Herdonius of Aricia was not partial to Tarquinius, and he accused the king of tyranny at home. He advised his countrymen to ignore Tarquin's words and return home. When the king finally arrived, he was displeased with the sentiment displayed. The meeting was adjourned for the day, and Tarquinius would present his case on the morrow. He lacked influence among the Latins to execute one of their own, so he had to resort to nefarious means. While everyone was asleep, Tarquinius bribed some disloyal Aricians, and they helped him smuggle large amounts of weapons into Turnus's quarters. Before the first light, he summoned an urgent meeting. He explained that a plot against his life had been uncovered. He led the chieftains to Turnus, and when the weapons were discovered there, they were appalled. Without waiting to hear him out, the other chieftains condemned him to a swift death. Having dealt with his greatest opposition, Tarquinius invited the Latins to renew the treaty his predecessor Tullus had concluded with Alba Longa. Hoping to henceforth share in Rome's glory, the Latins agreed, and the treaty was concluded. In this way, Tarquinius secured the whole of Latium and doubled the Roman army. In future, for every raised Roman legion, another allied legion, known as Ala, would join it. With this alliance in hand, Tarquinius chose to expand his realm. He was the first Roman king to wage war against the nearby Volscians. They could not stand against the combined armies of Rome and the Latins, and the Volscians were swiftly defeated. Tarquinius returned to Rome with large plunder and celebrated a triumph. Gabii, a powerful Latin stronghold near Rome, was unhappy with this new alliance and rebelled. Tarquinius marched on the city, but he was unable to breach its strong walls. his son Sextus Tarquinius pretended to abandon Rome and seek refuge in Gabii. There he gained the trust of the people and tricked them into facing the Roman legions in open battle. They were easily defeated and Gabii was taken. Upon returning to Rome, Tarquinius observed a strange omen. Worried, he sent his sons to Delphi to consult the oracle. They were accompanied by one Lucius Junius Brutus. The king killed his brother, and Lucius pretended to be a fool as not to attract his attention. When they arrived at Delphi, they were informed by the oracle that the kingship of Rome would fall to the man who kissed his mother first. While the two Tarquins argued over who should get this honor, Brutus pretended to stumble, and as he fell, he kissed the ground, for he knew that the earth was the common mother to us all. At that time, an old woman arrived in the city. She appeared before the king and offered him 9 books of prophecy as an exorbitant price. The king refused her, and the woman burned 3 of the books and repeated her offer. When Tarquinius again refused her, she burned 3 more books. The woman offered him the last 3 books at the same original price. Worried, Tarquinius consulted his augurs, who implored him to acquire the remaining books. These books, known as the Sibylline books, were kept in the temple of Jupiter. Throughout Roman history, they were consulted in times of momentous crises. The originals were lost in 83 BC when the temple of Jupiter was destroyed in a fire. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus continued his rule of terror until one of his sons brought a great calamity to his house. In a fit of lustful rage, Sextus Tarquinius violated a married woman named Lucretia. As soon as he left her side, she sent a message to both her father, Spurius Lucretius Tricipitinus, and her husband, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. They were instructed to make haste back to her house, each accompanied by a trusted friend. Her father came with Publius Valerius, and her husband with Brutus. Lucretia told the 4 men what had happened, and overwhelmed by shame, took her own life. In this moment of immense grief, Brutus held up the bloody knife and swore an oath to end the tyranny of the Tarquins and to never again let one man rule the city. Although the men were puzzled by this sudden change of character, they followed his lead and swore oaths to end the tyranny. They went to the forum and told the story of Lucretia. They reminded people that the king had seized the throne by force and spoke of all the terrors he had committed. The Roman population, oppressed for so long, decided to banish the Tarquins from the city. Having won over the Romans to his side, Brutus went to a nearby army camp and convinced the soldiers to join his cause. After ruling for 25 years, Tarquinius, recognizing his end, abandoned Rome and fled to Etruria with his family. Sextus Tarquinius fled to Gabii, hoping to rule the city, but the citizens remembered his treachery and he was killed. And thus, in 509 BC, 244 years after the founding of the city, the monarchy was at an end. 2 orchestrators of the coup, Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, were elected the first consuls of this fledgling republic. This account of the 7 kings of Rome is given to us by the Roman historian Titus Livius, who lived during the reign of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. This account presents numerous problems, for never in history did 7 kings rule uninterrupted for 244 years. As we have stated previously, Romulus arose from the indigenous founding myth, with his name simply meaning the Roman. His immediate successors, the devoted Numa Pompilius and the warlike Tullus Hostilius, are simple stereotypes. Although it's possible that men with these names ruled Rome at one time or another, nothing about their reigns can be stated with certainty. The following 2 kings, Ancus Marcius and Tarquinius Priscus, are more rounded characters, possibly pointing us to more historical figures than their predecessors. The 6th king, Servius Tullius, is the most complex, but also the most enigmatic of them all. His wide-ranging reforms and large construction projects had the greatest impact on the nature of the Roman state. Finally, the tyrant Tarquinius Superbus is the most likely to be a historical figure. Under his rule, Rome became the dominant power in central Italy, but he also brought an end to the monarchy itself. However, it's important to note that while the kings themselves might be mythical or semi-mythical characters, their recorded actions are for the most part historical. Numerous institutions and customs described in this episode really did develop before the rise of the Republic. Furthermore, when the kings were expelled, Rome was not a fledgling state, but already a dominant power in central Italy. To resolve the chronological problems, historians have resorted to one of 2 options. The earliest traces of the city-state on the banks of the Tiber are dated to the later part of the 7th century, more than 100 years after the date of the legendary founding. While some believe that the early kings are part of the pre-urban legends of Rome, others argue that all developments of the regal period should be placed between around 625 and 500 BC, thus considerably shortening the length of the period. The main episode from the reign of Romulus, regarding the Sabine women, has some basis in history. Although Livy claims that the Sabines settled on Capitoline Hill, archaeological evidence indicates that an early Sabine community lived on the Quirinal. Throughout Roman history, the citizens of Rome had another name for themselves. When acting in civil matters, they would refer to themselves as Quirites. The etymological connection with the Sabine language and their god Quirinus suggests that the early Latin community living on the Palatine merged with this Sabine community to form the city-state of Rome. If this development occurred at the end of the 7th century, the earliest kings, from Numa to Ancus, would have reigned until the middle of the 6th century. This would allow enough time for the development of early religious practices and the first Roman expansions into Latium. Following this chronology, the last 3, possibly historical kings of the Tarquin dynasty would have reigned for around 50 years. Some modern historians claim that the rise of Tarquinius Priscus marks the Etruscan conquest of Rome. However, the ancient sources are clear on this point. Every surviving record from ancient Rome claims that Priscus was legally elected to the throne. Tarquin's successor, Servius Tullius, is the first Roman king to take the throne illegally. Possibly the most interesting thing about him was the claim he was born a slave. The fact that one of their kings, let alone their most revered one, was a slave was deeply shameful for the Romans, and they tried to conceal it. Stories arose that he was actually the son of a defeated king of Corniculum, or more brazenly, the son of the fire god Vulcan. Surprisingly, a fragment from Etruscan sources concerning Servius was passed down to us from an unlikely place. In one of his speeches to the Senate, the scholar Emperor Claudius references a discovery he made in the Etruscan records. According to this speech, Mastarna was a follower of the legendary Etruscan adventurer Caelius Vibena. Following a turn of fortune, Mastarna led the remnants of Caelius's army to Rome, where he occupied one of the hills and renamed it Caelian, after his former leader. Mastarna then changed his name to Servius Tullius and took the throne of Rome. Interestingly, in a tomb in the Etruscan city of Vulci, a large fresco depicting Caelius and his followers was discovered. The scene shows Caelius and his men, including Mastarna, being rescued. In the process, they killed their captors, among whom is a man named Gnaeus Tarquinius of Rome. Some historians have claimed that this is none other than Tarquinius Priscus, but this raises the question of his prenomen, since Priscus is remembered as Lucius in the Roman records. It is said that Lucius is the Latinized form of his name Lucumo, but we know that Lucumo is an Etruscan word meaning king. It is therefore possible that the early Roman records confused the two names and forgot his real name Gnaeus. We must note that this is no more than conjecture, and at least for now, there is no way of concretely connecting the two Tarquins. This leaves us with two incompatible accounts of the origin of Servius Tullius. Original records referenced by the Emperor Claudius were lost, and we don't know to what extent they asserted that Mastarna and Servius were the same person. It is possible that they only indicated that Mastarna succeeded the Roman king Tarquinius, and that Claudius, well versed in early Roman history, made the connection himself. In reality, Mastarna could represent a missing link in the story. This brings us to the very nature of kingship in ancient Rome. Interestingly, not one king came from the great patrician clans of Rome. They were either outsiders, like Numa and Tarquinius Priscus, a slave like Servius, or low-born Romans, as is the case of Hostilius and Marcius. We know from later Roman history that the Pompilii, Hostilii, Marci, and Tullii were mostly plebeian gentes. This is unlikely to be an accident, and it suggests that patricians were not eligible for kingship, a stark contrast to the early consuls, who were exclusively patricians. The death of a king was followed by an interregnum, during which the patricians controlled the state. During an interregnum, an election was held, with the people choosing the king and the Senate ratifying their decision. It's unclear whether the people simply had to accept a candidate presented by the Senate or genuinely had a choice. Following the elections, the king was inaugurated through a special religious ceremony. The later Roman kings, culminating with Tarquinius Superbus, were increasingly depicted as Greek tyrants of the Archaic Age. Historians have previously interpreted this as a purely literary phenomenon, with ancient Roman authors modeling their reigns after prominent Greek tyrants. Although there is some truth in this, it's not entirely clear-cut. Firstly, the Greek tyrants and the Roman kings were likely products of similar historical circumstances to which they reacted in the same way. Secondly, 6th century Romans were already in contact with Greeks and were well aware of political developments in Greek polis. It is therefore entirely possible that the later kings set out to imitate their Greek counterparts and increasingly took on the characteristics of tyranny. Tyrants who took power illegally had to find a way to legitimize their positions. They would often emphasize their connection to the divine while positioning themselves as allies of the masses in opposition to the aristocracy. These elements can be clearly seen in the story of Servius Tullius, who not only claimed descent from Vulcan, but also emphasized the special connection to the goddess of luck, Fortuna. His reforms concerning the Comitia Centuriata are seen as a way of undermining the traditional aristocratic base of power. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, went even further. He patronized the arts and undertook grand building projects. Superbus pursued an aggressive foreign policy, finally subjugating the whole of Latium. He openly prosecuted the aristocracy and undermined the Senate. In the end, it was this oppressed aristocracy, not the people, that hatched a plot to overthrow the last king. The story of Lucretia and the fall of the Tarquins continues into the early years of the Roman Republic, with numerous attempts to reinstate Superbus on the Roman throne. The convoluted tale finally ends with the intervention of the Etruscan warlord Lars Porsena. The whole story is more akin to a grand epic than to a historical account. However, it is almost impossible to confirm nor outright reject any details of the story. The involvement of Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, two close relatives to the king, led some historians to suggest that the whole saga was a dynastic power struggle and not a republican revolution. The broader strokes of the story, however, may be correct. Whatever led to the initial bout of unrest around 500 BC, the Tarquins were expelled from the city, and Rome was soon engulfed in a broader struggle for control of Tyrrhenian Italy. Join us next time as we discuss these turbulent early years of the Roman Republic. We would like to thank our generous patrons who help us make these videos. If you are interested in supporting us, you can join our Patreon and vote in a member poll to help us choose the topic of the next short history video, which is slated to come out later this year.